So the only thing we seem to have is just this sort of rose-colored idea of 4 or 5, 6 years ago. Whatever it feels like was slightly better than now, whether or not it actually was.
It's like when Sartre says like existence precedes essence. So it's like um, the notion that can you imagine, and thus you develop your values, you know
Right.
your hopes and your dreams or whatever. That's how you imagine the world. But what if the world is intentionally designed increasingly to narrow your imagination? If you can't imagine the things which you want to see in the world, no matter how grand or how mundane, if you can't imagine anything other than what you see, then you won't act upon the world in such a way as to make what you see into what you want. And so I think a lot of way more attention should be paid to how much effort is put into constricting and constraining the imagination.
Well, I do wonder, just to tie it back to Debord, how much our generation, probably our parents' generation, maybe even potentially for some people their grandparents, have ever existed in a world where they were actually living and experiencing life in an active manner,
Hmm.
devoid of the pressures that and the sort of meaning that is projected upon us through various media consumption, right? Like when I was growing, okay, so we talk about the 90s a lot because that's when our childhood was, right? Our teenage years,
Yeah.
and I think back about that time and I oftentimes miss things like the diversity in music, right? Like last night on a whim, slightly in preparation for this podcast, my wife and I watched the 1995 MTV Music Awards. And we were
I gotta say it. That sounds very, very interesting, and I never would have thought about wanting to watch the MTV Music Awards from any year.
Well, oh, right, because in 1995, I wasn't watching the MTV Music Awards. That was a very uncool thing to do. But fast forward, 30 years, and the diversity of music, the diversity of artists, the diversity of genre, the sort of experimentation in the animation seems so much more interesting than today. And yet, it's still just a commodity. It's still just a corporate projection of youth onto a culture. But it just seems more interesting because it kind of was in some regard, right?
Yeah.
It was also more polarizing in that regard. I think as media institutions have become consolidated into fewer and fewer independent media outlets. I think things have gotten a lot more homogenized and designed for mass consumption, which means it's whatever edges it might have had to get filed down. But I look at my life and I think, and I lament things happening today, or I maybe lament the lack of what is perceived culture today. And I think, well, that time was better because I at least was had some mechanism by which I was me. But
Right.
the truth is, I didn't.
Right. Like you
I,
didn't at all. It seemed like it in comparison to, I don't know, I guess everybody else, maybe. I don't know.
well, that's
We were
what
like
I'm
maybe
saying is that
more convinced. We are more easily convinced back then.
I don't know. I don't know if we were more. Well, okay, so maybe, but let's see. 1995 I was 14 years old. If I asked a 14-year-old today, or if I examined their life, would they be any more or less convinced that they were actively leading life than I was at 14?
Hmm.
I would assume that they would feel like they are. I would assume that that feeling is exists at that time period. They may have other concerns and anxieties that I wouldn't have had, and I'm sure that certainly plays a part in it. But for many people, to imagine a world, to imagine, let's just stop there,
Yeah.
sort of requires an active living.
Yeah. I kind of I guess I don't have any hard data for this, but just from what I know from people who are like, in their early 20s, people who just graduated high school, people who are like 18, and I compare what I know of the way that they talk about things and what they hope for and imagine, or at least what they talk about to me. So who knows? But from my limited perspective, I could say I am certain that the horizons, on average, for young people are dramatically lower than they were, for us. And I'm certain that our horizons were dramatically lower than they were for our parents. When I talk to my dad,
Mm,
the things which my dad imagined for the future were way, way more wild and way more hopeful
mm,
and amazing than the things which I imagine for the future. And younger people, at least in my experience, they just kind of don't imagine a future. It's like they live in time, sure, but like really the easiest thing is ever since the pandemic, they don't so much seem to live in distinct years. I mean, none of us do,
right.
because it all just feels like 2020 is all kind of, it's like yesterday, even if it was actually fucking 5 years ago.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. You know, as a person, I feel very distinctly different than I did 5 years ago for a variety of personal reasons, as I'm sure you do as well, you know. But in terms of like landmark moments, my lifestyle doesn't feel drastically different than it has since then, which also makes time feel like it's not really changing. Like, and also there's a normalization of certain things that increasingly becomes more normal. So in 1999, the Columbine shooting is incredibly shocking, right? Even Sandy Hook, which I think was in 2012, seems kind of crazily shocking. And every year following that, it progressively seems less shocking. And also, the incident in and of itself seems far less important than the motives and usually the political affiliation and or cultural affiliation of the shooter.
Yeah,
That has seemed to take precedence because this idea of a school shooting just seems, or a mass shooting in general, just seems incredibly normalized.
it seems very banal. Like Columbine, that's seared into my memory. It's a very distinct moment. I wouldn't call it a traumatic moment, but it's very tragic. I have memories associated with it in terms of how I feel, how everyone acted. Even Sandy Hook was already like, when you said the word Sandy Hook, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. That was
Right.
another fucking shooting, and that was a long time ago. And I don't remember the names of the other shootings. I don't remember the names of. I'm just gonna guess the one that's happening like right now, or the
Right.
one that happened fucking last week. I don't remember the names of these scores of different locations and the names of any of these shooters. But I do remember how Marilyn Manson was supposed to be responsible for the Columbine shooting, which was unprecedented in its mindless brutality. And
Yeah.
now it's the most normal thing in the world. That's like a school shooting is kind of like I was going to say, it's kind of like a police brutality, police killing, which is, again,
Might be apt. I mean,
yeah, it might be apt. But again, it's like, they didn't used to be that way. And now it is. And now it's no longer a way to mark time at all. It's just another mundane, banal. It's definitely still horrifying, definitely still tragic. I'm
of
not
course.
trying to diminish this at all. I just mean to say that it is diminished as a phenomenon inside of our minds, unless we like specifically we conjure an emotional response because we feel obligated to.
Right. Well, you know, certainly something that I have thought about in the last 5 years is just the psychological effects that changing media has on the way that we think about the world. On like a real fundamental level, right? So if you go back to like the late 1800s or prior to the late 1800s, to say to someone or to present to someone a train moving towards them in any realistic manner could only be conceived of as actually a train coming at you or a tiger, whatever you want to use.
Right.
Right? Like you could imagine a play perhaps with a cardboard cutout or a wooden train. You could imagine um, some non-realistic version of that, maybe, but in no way would it make you feel like a train was coming at you in any real way. Then the
Right.
movies get created, and now you will never ever find anyone who would not consider that it's a possibility that it could be a projection. And that changes certain ways that we consider the world, right? Um, the move from largely localized entertainment, right? Even before The Godfather came out, movies would be released maybe in a couple of big cities at once, and then they would travel around the country for a year, maybe 2, 3 years even. So we didn't get everything at once, and it was still kind of localized. So there was a certain disconnection from everything happening all at once from us. So when things did happen, our brain was trained to be like, "Oh, that's a big deal,"
Yeah.
because I don't hear
Yeah.
about this all the time. Because I don't
Because
hear about a lot of things all the time.
before Twitter could let you know in real time whether or not the Kursk offensive, from the Ukrainian perspective, if the Kursk offensive was successful, or if the IDF's operation in Gaza was yielding results, or if it, whatever it was, that it was like now it's like watching a football game where
Yeah.
the score is updated in real time rather than reading the newspaper the day afterward. Except for it's not just a sporting event. It's not just a singular event that like pay-per-view, whatever. It's like everything is by the minute
Yes.
updated, so like you always know. And also, I kind of feel like that makes you kind of know much less as a result.
Well, here's an interesting thing, right? It's not just up to date, like up to date information. It's also what has transpired as the internet has expanded and grown. Is okay. Let's just use the example of watching a football game. That experience is fundamentally different now for many people, increasingly. In the olden days, you could only watch a football game live for a period of time, right? Or it would be more common to watch it in person, maybe to even
Right.
play it. So your relationship with the game of football was related to a directly personal connection.
Well, it was much more concrete. It was much more material. It was like, unless you were there, then you have to either talk to someone who was there, or you have to wait until the results get published in the newspaper the next day. And you say,
Right.
"Oh, this was what happened at the event that I missed." Like at every step along the way, whether you're physically there or you're physically not there, your relationship to it is mediated by the space in between and what you do in that space.
Right. Then, as the expansion of television grows, cable grows, channels like ESPN are launched. Now your relationship with the game of football is entirely mediated by how you watch it on television. If you've played football in your life, and I said, imagine a football game, most people will not imagine themselves playing football. They will imagine football as from the sort of sideline, overhead angle looking down at the field as presented on television. That's just where
Right.
our brain goes to.
Like unless you have the experience of being on the line of scrimmage, you would have
But
to imagine it by the way that you experience it, which is as a viewer, as a spectator. You wouldn't have the experience of being a player.
But even if you were a player, even if you played in high school, right? I bet you if you ask Christopher, imagine a freeze frame of football in your head. What does it look like? He'll probably talk about how it looks on television,
Yeah, that's
even
probably
if he
true.
himself has played it. Because our conception of it and our relationship with it is in relationship with everything is sort of mediated through this idea of television. Fast forward now into the internet age. Now we're not simply watching a game in real time, but we have analysts upon analysts upon analysts talking about all these aspects of every single player. Things like contract concerns and debates are news, what player did on their personal time. I mean, the idea of watching a football game. Oh, sorry. The idea
Is that from Lord of the Rings?
it sure is. The
Okay.
idea of watching a football game now is no longer a in person activity or experience. It is now a thing that is where the experience of the football game itself seems secondary to the components surrounding the football game, leading all the way into gambling. Right? I know a lot of people who are not particularly large football fans, with the exception that they gamble on football games regularly. They do, parlays and all these other things that you could do with gambling. And so the relationship to football is less about I'm a fan of a team and I'm rooting for the team. It now becomes, by the way that all the technology that is available, like we just completely think about it differently. It means different things to us now.
Yeah, and it's very far removed from like, what am I going to do, in order to make up for the last time when I fumbled the pass or whatever. Like when I
Right.
was playing with my friends at the park over the weekend. That's so far removed that even just watching the game sounds uh, idyllic. It sounds like something to romanticize in the same way that
Yeah.
we were just talking about with
Yes.
the
Politics.
well, let's say the good old days is the 1950s and 60s, except for who and
Yeah.
by what measures? Of course, compared to the 1990s or the 20 or the 1990s, like 30 years ago,
I
which
know.
is whatever. Compared to now, yeah, I could see why you would say from a certain point of view the good old days were the 1950s and 60s compared to the 1990s and the 2000s, but not compared to what hopes and dreams and aspirations you might have for yourself, for your children, for humanity. The 1950s and 60s were so much, they fell so short of the era, the way that people wanted to live, that that's why we have our memory of the 60s is about counterculture, it's about protests, it's about dropping out and living in a commune or else. Uh, it's about dissent. Because
Well,
in the good old days, we were really furious with how much the good old days didn't exist.
well, yeah, that's part of it. But also, like, and for anyone who knows me, I've had an obsession with the idea of counterculture for pretty much all my life.
Yeah,
There's a real romanticism about that, and I think though, as I've aged, I've come to really view this idea of the counterculture differently. In that what arose from that was this focus on the individual. It's almost like it draws from sort of this Protestant idea that like the only thing there is nothing between you and God. And if there's nothing between you and God, there's nothing between you and anything else.
right.
That you are the ultimate. You
Not
know?
just the ultimate arbitrator of your own destiny, but of material realities. Like, I am the arbitrator of everything. The
Yeah.
buck stops here, and so on.
Right. I mean, there is a sort of an occult way of thinking that the over the eons there is sort of this movement from a polythesis sort of society to a monothesis society to this idea of God as man. With if you're a Christian and you believe that Jesus came down as a man, to then what will come next, or maybe perhaps where we're in as God as man or man as God, right? And so from this sort of spiritual and ideological differing from where we had been prior to World War II, the components that I think lead to the spectacle or spectacular society are sort of born out of that, are born out of that individualism. Because as the individual becomes important and the mechanisms to in any important way express oneself individualistically are sort of not there. To your point, there people are upset about these things not being there. Well, it's the market seems to have no problem coming in and saying to this new group, this sort of new citizen of person, the teenager, which is really only born again post World War II in the
Yeah.
way that we conceptualize it today, with lots of commodities that they can purchase to define themselves.
Well, and on the subject of romanticizing a relatively less distorted reality, it's again to go back to Debord actually twice in the Society of the Spectacle. He makes this reference to the slide from having to appearing, and
Yeah.
And I think that can be really illustrated by this quote. It says, I think it's also from the Society of the Spectacle, rather than the film we actually watched. Well, whatever. It's just, so it's kind of a long quote. He says that stars, spectacular representations of living human beings, project this general banality into images with permitted roles. As specialists of apparent life, stars serve as superficial objects that people can identify with in order to compensate for their fragmented, productive specializations that they actually live. The function of these celebrities is to act out various lifestyles or socio-political viewpoints in a full, totally free manner. They embody the inaccessible results of social labor by dramatizing the byproducts of that labor, which are magically projected above it as its ultimate goals, power and vacations. The decision-making and consumption that are at the beginning and the end of a process that is never questioned. On one hand, a governmental power may personalize itself as a pseudo-star. On the other, a star of consumption may campaign for recognition as a pseudo-power over life, but the activity of these stars are not really free. They offer no real choices.